In the remote countryside of Vermont, where winding dirt roads disappear into morning mist, and the wind howls through towering pine trees like whispers from a long-forgotten past, there sat a small animal rescue center tucked deep within the forest. Hidden behind weathered wooden fences and perpetually closed gates, this center wasn't known for heartwarming fairy tales about dogs finding loving homes. On the contrary, people spoke of the place in hushed tones, all because of one name that had become more warning than memory. Max was a large German shepherd, his body built like iron muscles, coiled tight, and his dark eyes as deep and still as a blackened well. His name echoed down the hallways of the shelter like a curse. No one, not even the most seasoned volunteers, dared venture too close to Max's kennel. On the rusted steel bars hung a sign printed in glaring red capital letters: "Dangerous, do not approach." Inside, Max didn't bark, didn't whimper, didn't seek attention like the others. He didn't need pity. He didn't want sympathetic glances. Instead, Max growled low in his throat. Eyes narrowed with silent warning, and if anyone ventured too close, he would lunge at the bars with terrifying speed, as if to rip them apart just to remind them, stay away. No one knew exactly what Max had been through. 8 months earlier, he'd been found chained to a rusted fence at an abandoned farm in the middle of a thunderstorm. No food, no water, not a single soul in sight. His ribs jutted out under patches of dull matted fur, once glossy, now worn thin by time and trauma. Rumors spread that Max had once been trained as a guard dog, or worse, used in violent, coercive activities where trust was shattered into fear and survival instinct was twisted into rage. But those were just guesses, because Max never spoke and his eyes didn't tell stories. They simply looked deep, cold, and broken. Within his narrow world, a cold metal cage, Max had built himself a fortress of solitude. He trusted no one, especially not men. Every time a man walked past, Max would snap to attention, snarling teeth bared as if the ghosts of old wounds still lingered in his memory. Behaviorists had tried to work with him. Sedatives were used, training programs implemented. Nothing worked. He was like a door bolted shut with locks not made of metal, but of trauma and ruin. In the shelter's office, there had been 3 separate attempts to file paperwork recommending Max be transferred to a specialized facility, a polite way of saying permanent confinement or euthanasia. But each time someone had quietly vetoed the decision. Maybe it was because, despite everything, Max had never actually bitten anyone. Maybe it was because in those storm cloud eyes, there was still a fragment of something unbroken. Or maybe no one had the courage to truly face him. So Max remained a shadow haunting the rescue center, a lesson no one dared to learn. Until one day the creaky wooden doors opened, and in stepped a woman with eyes like still water, calm, deep, and beside her a young girl with curly brown hair and a well-worn sketchbook tucked under her arm. No one really knew what Max had been through, but some things don't need to be said aloud because his body had already told the story. When Max was found, he was chained to the rusted fence of a desolate, decaying farm where broken shutters banged against the walls in the howling wind, and the clinking of the chain echoed like a cry of despair amidst a storm. Rain poured from the sky like a silver curtain, thunder cracking violently above. And in the heart of that chaos, Max lay curled up motionless like stone. His eyes were half closed, no longer resisting. Just a faint breath left in him, and a look that seemed to say, "I'm ready to give up." He was discovered by an old farmer living nearby, drawn by the eerie howls he had heard the night before. When the beam of his flashlight landed on Max, what he saw was not a dog. It was a miracle of survival clinging to life by the thinnest, most fragile thread. Max's chest was sunken, his ribs visibly poking through torn, filthy skin. His eyes were dark voids hollowed out by something deeper than pain. There was something in that gaze that made the old man take a step back, not from fear, but from an ache so deep it stung the soul. No one could say how long Max had been left there, but there was no water, no food, no trace of any life. Only a rusted chain wound tightly around his neck. so tight it had carved raw grooves into his flesh. Veterinarians at the shelter said it was a miracle he had survived at all, but they also admitted solemnly he might never recover mentally. From the very first day at the rescue center, Max displayed a clear, unshakable reaction. He wouldn't let any man come near him. Every time a male figure passed his kennel, even in silence, Max would spring to his feet, growling, baring teeth, lunging at the bars like a spring wound for years. Once a new staff member carelessly stood too close. Max nearly broke through the cage, hurling himself with such force that the door shuddered like something had kicked it from within. He had never bitten anyone, but his presence was a living warning cloaked in silence and tension. He didn't bark for attention. He didn't whine. Max watched, waited, and reacted only when he felt threatened. What puzzled everyone, though, was his sheer will to survive. Max didn't starve himself. He didn't shut down completely. He lived, he watched, he stayed on guard, wrapped in an invisible armor, always ready not to attack but to defend, not out of hatred but necessity. Some speculated Max had been raised as a guard dog, but those who spent time trying to understand him disagreed. They believed he hadn't been trained to protect but to instill fear. Max didn't respond to commands. He acted out of instinct. He couldn't tell friend from foe. To Max, all humans meant danger. And that kind of reaction can only come from a past of savage abuse, beatings or brutal abandonment. Behaviorists tried everything: food toys, recordings of puppies, whimpering. Nothing worked. Max didn't soften. He didn't flinch. He was like tempered steel, cold and unyielding with emotions locked away behind ice. Sedatives merely rendered him unconscious for a time, only to wake him more wary, more mistrustful. Max had learned one thing above all: nothing in this world is safe, not even kindness. At the shelter, Max became a symbol of tragedy and helplessness, a puzzle with no solution. Each time someone came looking to adopt, they would pass by Max's kennel quickly, not daring to look too long. To them, Max wasn't a dog waiting for rescue. He was a scar too painful to touch. But then one day, something in Max's gaze, usually still and silent, as windless night shifted. Not for food, not for a voice, but for the eyes of a strange little girl named Emma who said nothing. She just stood there looking at him without fear. That morning, the rescue center lay under a suffocating silence. Just another day. Light drizzle tapped against the old tin rooftops, and in the long, quiet row of kennels, Max remained curled in his dark corner, eyes wide open like a shadow that never slept. No one knew that something different was about to happen. No one could have predicted that a single small pair of footsteps would shake the frozen world. Max had sealed himself inside. Sarah stepped through the creaky wooden door of the shelter, holding a weathered gray umbrella, raindrops clinging to her coat. As a trauma therapist, she had seen far too much pain in human faces. But today she wasn't here as a doctor. She came with Emma, her 10-year-old daughter, a girl with loosely curled brown hair and eyes witty and clear as an untouched lake. Emma clutched her sketchbook tightly, her little boots splattered with mud. She didn't speak much. She simply looked silently, studying the rows of cages where forgotten souls waited for a fragile hope for a hand to reach out. On paper, Sarah was only bringing her daughter here to keep a promise. Emma had said she wanted to learn more about animals, to draw stray dogs and understand their wordless language. Sarah had no intention of bringing anyone home, no plans to rescue anyone, no plans to open her heart. But then they passed the last kennel, the one that belonged to Max. Max didn't bark, didn't move. He only lifted his head, and his dark, hollow gaze pierced through the two of them like the edge of a blade. Emma stopped first. Sarah reached out to guide her away, but Emma stood still. The silence tightened, brittle like glass on the verge of shattering. Max slowly rose, his massive body radiating a chilling wariness. Instinctively, as someone who worked with trauma survivors, Sarah understood instantly. This animal wasn't just aggressive. He was evaluating, judging, calculating. And then no growl, no sudden lunge, only those eyes intense but not filled with hate. They were filled with fear. fear of being hurt again. He's not angry, Emma whispered, her voice light as the breeze. He's scared. Sarah looked at her daughter. Emma's eyes didn't blink, locked on Max as though speaking in a language adults had long forgotten. And in that moment, Sarah realized something was shifting, not in Max, but in herself. She crouched down beside the kennel, keeping a respectful distance, as if approaching a panic-stricken patient. "May I sit here for a while?" she asked softly to the shelter manager. The woman, Trish, the only one who had never fully given up on Max, hesitated, then nodded. "He won't come near," Trish warned. "Don't expect anything." "That's okay," Sarah replied with a quiet smile. "I'm not here to ask anything of him." Emma sat next to her, mother silent, calm, not touching. She pulled a small piece of paper from her coat pocket, a drawing of a bog curled up beneath a tree, and gently slid it under the kennel bars. Max didn't react. He only watched Sarah open her bag and pulled out a book. She began to read, not to Max, but with him acknowledging his presence, respecting it, as if he were a person who had every right to simply be without performing, without pleasing. Trish stood a few feet away, arms crossed. "This girl," she murmured, "she's not afraid." "That's rare. She sees something the rest of us don't," Sarah replied, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "And sometimes what we really need is to stop and look harder." Inside the kennel, Max still didn't move, but one of his ears twitched slightly every time Emma gave a soft laugh, and his eyes for the first time glanced not only at Sarah but at the little girl. A tiny shift, almost imperceptible. But for someone who had kept his soul locked away for so long, it was an earthquake. And Sarah knew without a doubt he was listening. That moment when Max's gaze briefly settled on Emma, no one spoke. Not a single movement broke the thick silence, as heavy and still as the cold mist in the kennel. But for Sarah, who had worked with hundreds of trauma survivors, she knew with certainty an eye no longer driven purely by threat is a breakthrough more powerful than any promise. "I think he's testing me," Emma said softly, her eyes never leaving Max. Sarah nodded, exhaling slowly. "Yes. And you didn't flinch. That means more than anything." Just then footsteps echoed down the hallway. Heavy, familiar. It was David, a longtime volunteer. He was a good man, but his sturdy build, firm steps, and deep voice always triggered Max's most violent responses. And like a storm uncoiling, Max sprang up, his powerful frame launching forward, front paws slamming into the kennel bars so hard they rattled with a metallic roar. His growl exploded through the corridor, echoing down the concrete walls. Both Trish and David startled at the sound. Emma stepped back slightly, but didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply placed a hand on her mother's knee and squeezed gently. "He doesn't want to be hurt again," Emma whispered. Her voice was quiet, but it struck Sarah like a bell ringing in a cathedral. Max kept growling, but what shocked Sarah wasn't the sound, it was where he was looking. He wasn't watching Emma. He wasn't watching her. His eyes were locked solely on the man. It was targeted, specific, intentional. Max knew who was who. He remembered, and he was afraid. Trish shook her head. "I've told you this dog. He has no future with people. He only knows how to defend himself." "No," Sarah replied, still watching Max, who had now retreated to the corner. Panting hard, ears still pricked. "Yes, he's defending himself, but not wildly, not randomly. He has a reason he's trying to survive, and he hasn't given up." And then Emma's small voice filled the room, not as a protest, but as a statement of quiet conviction. "He's never growled at me, not once, even though I sat really close." Trish and Sarah both turned to look at her. A simple truth, yet one none of the adults had noticed. Max, the dog that made the entire center tread in fear, had never shown a single sign of aggression toward Emma. No barking, no retreat, no growling, only watching, observing silence. Trish sighed, and for a fleeting second, something gentle flickered in her aged eyes. Maybe she's the first person he sees and doesn't feel the need to guard himself against," she murmured. Sarah turned to her daughter, gently touching her shoulder. "What do you see in him, sweetheart?" Emma thought for a moment, then smiled a small, uncertain smile like a candle flickering in the dark. It's like he's standing behind a locked door that's been shut for a very long time. Everyone tries to break it open, but sometimes all you really have to do is knock softly and wait. Sarah froze. Yes, not everyone needs saving through force. Some souls need time space. And someone willing to wait patiently until they open the door themselves? Max didn't growl again. He sat quietly in the corner, eyes still watchful, but his ears, they had drooped ever so slightly. A small sign, but unmistakable. The first signal from behind a sealed fortress. Max had just cracked the door open. It rained all through the night. Sarah sat alone in her study beside a thick file labeled Max, Risk Level 5 file. The pages were yellowed with time, marked with urgent notations, no direct interaction, unresponsive to behavioral treatment, not suitable for family environment. In the past, when faced with a file like this, Sarah would immediately assess the risks, bullet point danger indicators, analyze behavioral triggers, and suggest a management plan. But tonight she wasn't looking at Max as a case, and she saw him as a living being trapped inside his own fear, who had somehow let a child step inside that prison. In the next room, Emma was asleep, arms still wrapped around her sketchbook, holding the drawing of Max lying beneath a tree, not growling, not guarded, just still a dream. Sarah wasn't sure it could ever come true, but the belief in her daughter's eyes had planted something in her, a trust beyond logic, but impossibly real. And the next morning, Sarah did something even she considered reckless. She filled out the adoption form for Max. An emergency meeting was called that same afternoon at the rescue center. Sarah stood before the board alongside Trish, the only person in the room on her side. The atmosphere was heavy with skepticism, with long stares and quiet doubts to Morgan. The head veterinarian tapped his pen against the table and spoke sternly. Max is dangerous, unpredictable. We're not talking about a dog that's just scared. We're talking about an animal that has tried to rip through steel bars. And you want to bring him into your home where a 10-year-old child lives. Max doesn't attack out of hatred, Sarah replied, her voice calm but firm. He reacts from instinct because the only thing he's ever learned from humans is fear and pain. Another board member interjected sharply. You're a single mother. You work and raise a child. How do you expect to monitor a dog that needs round-the-clock supervision? Sarah looked straight at them, unwavering. I work from home. I specialize in trauma rehabilitation. And Emma, my daughter isn't reckless. She's the only one Max hasn't growled at, hasn't backed away from, hasn't feared. That alone speaks volumes. Then Trish stood breaking the heavy silence. I was there, she said. I saw that moment. Emma sat beside Max for almost an hour. He didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't lunge. Do you understand how rare that is? There are grown professionals who can't even walk past him without triggering a panic response. But that girl, she didn't force anything. She didn't demand. She just was present, and Max responded. The room fell silent again. Outside, the sky had grown darker clouds, thick like smoke. Then came the vote. The final ballot flipped the outcome, 4 in favor, 3 against. Approval granted with strict conditions. Weekly behavioral check-ins, regular sessions with a certified trainer, immediate return if any signs of danger appeared. As Sarah signed the adoption agreement, her hand trembled slightly. But just beyond the glass door, she saw Emma watching, a small smile on her face like the first light of winter's end. I knew you'd see what I saw, Emma mouthed. Sarah didn't answer. She just smiled. The decision had been made. And from that moment on, she knew. This wasn't an adoption. This was a rescue mission, not just for Max, but for herself and her daughter too. Max, the dog who had become a symbol of fear and hopelessness, was about to have a home, and they, as Sarah and Emma, were about to begin a journey. No textbook could ever prepare them for the day Max went home. The skies over Vermont were heavy with thick gray clouds. Wind howled through the trees, sending late autumn leaves swirling in the air, as if something important was about to happen. Sarah stood in the small parking lot of the rescue center, eyes fixed on the iron door that led to the kennels, out back where Max was being prepared for release. Her heart pounded not out of fear of Max, but because she knew too well any mistake today could shatter everything they'd worked for. Emma sat quietly on a bench near the car, clutching her sketchbook like a lucky charm. She didn't speak, but her eyes followed every movement in the distance, where volunteers were nervously unlocking Max's kennel with the intensity of a tiny warrior. And then Max appeared. He didn't lunge, didn't bark, but his massive frame was tight as a drawn bow, ears erect, eyes darting, tracking every motion around him. A thick leather collar still circled his neck, the kind reserved for dogs with a history of violent reactions. But Sarah knew it wasn't aggression that drove him. It was fear. "We tried getting him into the crate," Trish whispered. He growled nonstop. Maybe we should use a sedative." "No," Sarah cut in firmly. "Max has to choose to come out. If we force him, he'll believe this is just more of the same control, fear pressure. Today has to be different." She quickly opened the back of her SUV, pulling out a mesh divider she had prepared in advance, creating a closed yet unconfined space, a temporary safe zone just for Max. Inside, she'd laid thick blankets, placed a bowl of water, and a silent rubber toy. Max stood frozen. His eyes shifted as Emma slowly stepped closer, not too close, just enough to place a small piece of paper next to him, a drawing of herself in the car, sitting beside Max, both looking out the window. "We wait," Sarah murmured, more to herself than anyone else. And so time stopped. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Max didn't move. He stood like stone, breathing heavily, ears twitching at every noise. Whenever someone approached, he took a step back, lips slightly parted, not a threat but a plea. "Don't make me." Emma didn't rush him. She simply sat on the shelter's steps, arms wrapped around her knees, watching him with the kind of gaze no one else could hold. One without expectation, without judgment, only quiet presence, then a miracle. Max sat down, not from exhaustion, but because he had stopped retreating. A small moment, but enough for Sarah to glance at Trish, who stood beside her, holding her breath. "He's thinking," Trish whispered. 5 minutes later, Max took a step toward the car, then another. Slowly, carefully, as if measuring each inch of ground, and then he stepped inside. No leash, no force Max had chosen. Sarah closed the door gently. Hands cold with nerves, Emma didn't say a word. She pressed her small palm against the side window, right where Max's eyes had just been, as if making a silent promise. "We won't leave you." The car rolled forward, weaving past rows of bare trees. In the back, Max lay down, body taut, eyes glued to the outside world. He didn't know where he was going, but in that space, unforced, unbound, for the first time in his life, he didn't have to fight to survive. Up front, Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly. She knew this was just the beginning, but today Max had done something no one thought possible. He had stepped out of the cage of fear by his own will. The small house at the edge of the forest had never felt so quiet. But the quiet didn't bring peace. It was full of tension, shallow breathing, and a fragile stillness, as if the entire space was bracing for a storm to explode at any moment. From the moment Max stepped through the doorway, everything in Sarah's home changed. Not in the magical way fairy tales describe, where pets curl up in their owner's laps and find a home overnight. No, this was different. Every footstep felt like it moved across thin ice. Every silence could mean hope, or impending collapse. Max didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't make a sound. He moved like a silent giant shadow across the hallway, then curled up in the far corner of the living room where sunlight never reached. Any movement from Sarah or Emma caused his ears to twitch violently, his eyes snapping toward them with intense vigilance. But he didn't growl. He didn't attack. He simply tensed like a survivor in a trench who no longer believed in the concept of safety. On the first day, Max didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't move from the mat beneath the window. Emma placed a bowl nearby near the door, along with a small drawing, a picture of Max lying under a tree, this time beside a little girl reading a book. I think he needs to know he's not being left behind, Emma whispered. Sarah didn't interfere. She knew pressure is the enemy of trust, and trust when forced never grows. That night after the lights were off, Sarah quietly reviewed footage from a small camera she had placed in the corner of the room. The image was grainy, but clear enough. Max finally crept toward the bowl, took a few cautious sips of water, then returned to the dark corner, lying down with his back turned. It was the first victory, but each day that followed brought a new challenge. Max was terrified of unfamiliar sounds, especially sudden ones like a spoon falling or the window banging in the wind. Every time he flinched hard, backed into the wall, eyes wide with panic, chest heaving like a balloon about to burst. Emma asked, "Why is he even afraid of the wind, Mom?" Sarah placed a hand gently on her daughter's shoulder. Because maybe in his past, every sound was a sign that something bad was about to happen. One night as Sarah was reading quietly under the warm yellow lamp, Max suddenly stood up, his entire body going stiff, then began pacing in small, tight circles filled with anxious tension. Sarah set the book down and watched silently. Max moved toward the back door. Sarah understood. She rose slowly and walked toward it. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, Max growled. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. His teeth bared his body, crouched eyes lit with a fierce alertness. Sarah froze, then slowly dropped her hand from the door. Max didn't attack. Instead, he passed by her, slipping through the opening, and walked into the yard. There in the darkness, Max turned once in a circle, then squatted. And Sarah realized this was the first time he had tried to communicate. He was learning to ask in his own way. The next day, Emma hung a small bell by the door. If he wants to go out, he can just touch this, she said, so he knows he has a choice. Sarah looked at her daughter and her heart clenched. In those early stormy days when tension threatened to choke every room, Emma still believed, and Max, even if he didn't understand yet, he stayed. He didn't run, he didn't fight, he simply remained. And in his silence, that was how Max began to trust. Trust sometimes doesn't arrive like a gust of wind blowing the door wide open. It creeps in bit by bit like morning sunlight trying to pierce through thick curtains. For Max, trust didn't bloom. It had to be fought for, carved out piece by fragile piece. The second week in the new home began with a small change. Max began eating while Sarah and Emma were still in the room, but only if they sat still silent without looking at him. He moved slowly toward the bowl, head low, ears flat each step as if crossing a minefield. But he ate, and he didn't retreat. "Mom, what does that mean?" Emma asked, eyes shining. "It means he's starting to believe. No one will take anything from him," Sarah replied. "That here turning his back doesn't mean getting hurt." Day by day, Max began sleeping deeper, no longer curling into a tight ball as if bracing for impact. Sarah noticed he stopped lying against the wall and started settling closer to the center of the room, a small but powerful signal. Max was beginning to let the world see his back. He was no longer prey. He was beginning to relax. Emma continued, leaving him a small drawing next to his food bowl each morning. A heart, a goofy cat, a scene of Max. Max under a tree. When Sarah asked her why, Emma simply smiled and said, "So he knows he doesn't go through the day alone." Then came that night. It wasn't raining, but the wind howled, creaking the eaves, whispering like ghostly footsteps above the house. Sarah sat on the living room floor reading a new habit to help Max feel less threatened when suddenly Max stood up. No warning, no growl, just a shift in energy so sharp it made the air crackle. Max began pacing tight, anxious circles, tongue out, panting heavily. He moved toward the back door, then circled back. Then again, each time edging closer. Each time more desperate. Sarah recognized the signs. It wasn't a panic attack, it was a need. Max wanted to go out but didn't know how to ask. She rose slowly and approached the door. But the moment her hand touched the knob, Max lunged. Sarah froze. A low growl, teeth flashed in the dim light, but there was no bite, no contact. Max didn't attack her. He charged past her. She turned instinctively, and in that instant, she understood Max wasn't angry. He was scared. He was trying to control the panic, and somehow he had chosen not to hurt anyone. He ran into the yard, circling once, then squatting, chest heaving. Sarah stood on the porch, watching from afar. The wind whipped through her hair, tugged at her coat. But her heart was still. "You chose not to bite," she whispered, placing a hand gently over her chest as if to confirm she was still unharmed. The next morning, as Max entered the room, Emma was waiting by the door. She held up a small brass bell tied with a red ribbon and hung it gently near the frame. "If you want to go outside," she said, "just hit this, we'll know." Max looked at her. He didn't move closer, but he didn't move away either. His eyes lingered on the bell for a moment, then shifted to Emma. Then he returned to his spot. Sarah, watching from behind, placed a hand softly on her daughter's shoulder. "You just taught him something important." "What is it, Mom?" "That being able to choose is a kind of love, too." That night, Max didn't lie near the door. He lay closer to the fireplace where the warm light flickered across the walls, not beside anyone, but close enough to feel the warmth of a family. Sarah said nothing. She simply exhaled a full breath from deep within her chest for the first time in days. A dog had learned not to bite when afraid, and to her that was nothing short of a miracle. It was a Saturday afternoon that felt like any other. A light breeze, cold but no rain. The small wooden house on the edge of the forest wore a pale winter light that softened everything. In the kitchen, Myra was chopping carrots for dinner, her hands moving quickly, but her mind stayed alert, tuned into every sound in the house. She never allowed herself to fully relax when Max was near Emma. Not out of fear, but because, even with progress, unpredictability always lingered. Emma sat on the living room floor, legs crossed, coloring her latest drawing. In it, Max lay under a snow-covered tree, his eyes half closed, his expression peaceful. Every now and then, she glanced out the window where Max lay less than 2 meters away. He wasn't asleep, but he seemed more at ease than ever before. His large body stretched out, head resting on his front paws, ears twitching slightly with the rustling of leaves outside. Then a loud engine roared in the distance, shattering the fragile stillness. A delivery truck rolled up its tires, crunching on the gravel driveway. Sarah looked up. Emma set down her pencil. Both instinctively turned to Max. He had already bolted upright. In a single breath, his body shifted from calm to coiled tight. Bang! A heavy knock on the front door. Click. The doorknob turned. Sarah dropped the knife. Everything happened too fast, and then Max charged like a streak of lightning slicing through the room. No bark, no warning, only movement, fast, sharp, decisive. His powerful body slid across the wooden floor, skidding to a stop in front of the door, planting his front paws with force, his body rising, blocking the threat from reaching Sarah. And then he growled, but this wasn't like before. This wasn't the growl of a trapped animal. It was the growl of a guardian. Deep, guttural, commanding, the kind that chilled your bones. Sarah froze. She didn't call Max's name, didn't try to pull him back, didn't give any command. She did the one thing she knew might help him keep control. She stayed quiet. "Please leave the package on the porch," she called out evenly, voice calm, clear. From the window, Sarah saw the young delivery man freeze, panic flashing in his eyes. He placed the box on the steps and ran to his truck like he'd seen a ghost. The door remained closed. Max remained planted, his body still rigid, chest heaving. Emma stepped forward, slowly, not too close, then gently knelt. "You're not just scared anymore," she whispered. "You're protecting." Max turned his head. His eyes were no longer wild with panic. They were sharp, present, intentional. Terry quietly stepped up beside her daughter and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you see?" she said softly. "He didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't curl into the corner. He stood between us and danger." Max slowly lowered himself. He didn't return to the shadows. He lay down right there in front of the door, head resting between his paws, eyes still open. watchful that night as the firelight danced across the walls in glowing ribbons. Max didn't move. He lay by the door like a silent sentinel, a soldier who had chosen his post. Sarah didn't call him, didn't praise him, didn't break the moment. She just whispered, "Thank you, Max, for not being afraid anymore, for trusting that this is your family too." Emma sketched another picture in her notebook. Max standing in front of the door, head lowered, body strong and proud like a statue. This time, she said softly, "I drew him as a hero, not because he changed, but because he chose to." Winter had arrived, covering the valley in a cold white blanket of snow. The sky hung gray like a colorless painting, pressing heavily on every breath drawn in the mountains and woods. But inside Sarah and Emma's little wooden house nestled near the forest edge, surrounded by the warm light of the fireplace and the messy sketches in Emma's notebook, a different kind of life was slowly returning. A soul once shattered now, learning how to love again. Max, it had been weeks since the night Max rushed to protect the family from the surprise delivery. Since then, something had changed in him. He no longer avoided eye contact. He no longer curled up in the shadows. Now Max followed Sarah from the kitchen to the living room, from the porch to the woods behind the house. He was no longer just a quiet shadow. He had become something living, watchful, yes, but fully present with a clear sense of purpose. A guardian. Emma no longer needed to leave drawings for him every morning. Now Max came to her on his own, whenever she sat to sketch, sometimes even lying down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence. Sarah noticed it, and she knew every step forward, no matter how small, was a miracle earned through patience and understanding. One snowy morning, fresh powder blanketed the forest like soft quilts stretched across the trees. Emma had caught a cold and was curled up on the couch under thick blankets, holding a mug of hot cocoa. Sarah decided to take Max out for a walk instead of letting him pace around indoors all day. The wind was bitter, but Max didn't react the way he once would have. He moved lightly through the snow, sniffing trails, ears perked alert, but calm. Sarah unclipped the leash for just a few minutes, a reward for a week of good behavior. Max wandered into the forest, his movements primal, instinctual, like a wild animal tracking something unseen. But only a few minutes later, he froze. His whole body went tense like a drawn bow. Nose forward, ears stiff, every hair along his spine raised. Sarah picked up her pace, heart pounding. "Max," she called softly. But he didn't turn. Instead, he bolted, no hesitation, no fear. Sarah ran after him, her boots sinking into snow, her heart slamming in her chest. Branches scratched her arms, rocks caught her feet. Wind roared in her ears, but she kept going. And then she saw Max. He stood still beside a figure collapsed in the snow, half buried, half exposed. A young man, probably in his 20s, face pale lips, bluish breath, barely visible. A torn backpack lay nearby, mud-caked boots, one leg clearly twisted. Max didn't bark, didn't nudge, but he didn't move away either. He stood guard, eyes locked on the man as if daring the storm itself to come closer. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the stranger, pulling out her phone. 911. There's a man hurt unconscious in the forest. She checked his pulse, weak, but there Max, seeing Sarah approach, stepped back, not retreating, just making room. He stayed nearby, silent, ready. When the rescue team arrived, 3 men in heavy uniforms, their boots thudding in the snow. Max tensed again. He lowered his head, let out a low growl. But this time Sarah gently placed a hand on his neck and whispered calmly, "It's okay. They're here to help." And Max stayed silent, but he didn't back down. He stood beside her, breath forming white clouds in the cold air. A living statue, a protector awakened. That night, as Sarah told the story to Emma, now recovering from her cold, her daughter listened in silence. Then Emma held up her newest drawing, Max standing in the snow beside the collapsed man, Sarah's hand resting on his shoulder. "I think he didn't just change," Emma said softly. "He chose to." Sarah couldn't speak. She only hugged her daughter tight, and for the first time felt that Max's presence was no longer a challenge, but a living miracle born from pain. News of the rescue in the snowy forest spread faster than any winter wind. The young man who had gotten lost, a local hiker, was found suffering from hypothermia and a broken leg just hours away from death. But what shocked people even more than the fact that he had survived was who had found him first. A German shepherd, once classified as dangerous and beyond rehabilitation, Max. When a small article appeared in the local paper with the headline, "Dog Once Feared Saves a Life, a Story of Healing from the Shadows," Sarah's phone rang nonstop. This time it wasn't a warning, not suspicion. It was an invitation from the very rescue center that had once wanted Max removed from society. Now they wanted Sarah and Max to return to share their story with others, hoping to adopt traumatized dogs. On the day they returned to the shelter, Sarah didn't say much. She quietly reached for Max's leash, but before she could clip it on, Emma ran up. "Let me," she said. Sarah hesitated for a moment. Emma smiled, a smile wiser and steadier than when they had first walked into Max's broken world months ago. "I think Max walks better when I'm beside him." Sarah nodded. The door opened. The snow had melted into streaks of mud and puddles across the road, but nothing slowed Max down. He walked forward, steady, calm, deliberate, beside the little girl who had taught him what trust felt like. As they stepped through the shelter gates, familiar faces turned wide-eyed. No one spoke, some instinctively backed away, but then they saw what no one had dared to imagine. Max, no muzzle, no sedatives, no restraints, walked quietly, eyes scanning the room. But his body relaxed. Trish was the first to step forward. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "I never thought I'd see him walk out of that kennel with a human." Sarah simply smiled. Max didn't walk out because of someone else. He walked out because he chose to come. In the education room, more than 10 people were waiting, some hoping to adopt, others just curious about the darkest case in Vermont. Max lay down at Emma's feet, head resting near her heels, eyes half closed, as if being here wasn't a threat anymore. Sarah stood before them, her voice strong and steady. "I'm not a dog trainer. I don't use tricks. I'm a trauma therapist, and what I've learned from people I use with Max, no one needs to be controlled. They need to be given a choice." She paused, looking down at Max. He remained still. Max didn't need to be fixed. He wasn't broken. He just needed to be seen. A young woman sitting at the back raised her hand, eyes glistening. "There's a shy shepherd in the back row. He doesn't look at anyone. Do you think he could be like Max?" Sarah smiled. "Every dog has a story, but if you're willing to listen, really listen with your whole heart, then yes, I believe any story can find a new ending." That evening, when the little family returned to their peaceful wooden home by the forest's edge, the sunset stretched golden across the snow. Sarah quietly watched Max curled up by the fire, one paw resting on the rug, his breath slow and steady. On the wooden wall hung a photo timeline, each milestone. The first time Max entered the house, the first night he lay near Emma, the first time he rang the bell to go outside, the day he stood guard at the door to protect his family. Between the photos hung a simple blue-rimmed certificate, honorary trauma recovery volunteer, Emma Moore. Sarah gently brushed the hair of her daughter who had fallen asleep on the sofa. "You taught Max something I never could," she whispered. "Not just with love, but with patience, with quiet at the right moments, and with understanding that goes deeper than fear." Max lifted his head. His eyes caught the glow of the fire, and Sarah smiled. No more ghosts, no more warnings, just a duke and a family who had waited long enough for him to choose to step out of the dark. Spring arrived late that year. Snow still clung in patches at the forest's edge, but tender buds had begun to peek through the frozen soil. The wind no longer howled like sharp blades, but softened like a gentle hand stroking across the old wooden windows of the little house by the woods. But for Sarah, Emma, and Max, spring didn't come from nature. It came from within them. That morning, sunlight streamed through the trees and poured through the glass window. Sarah woke not from a sound, but from a strange feeling. Complete peace, no heavy footsteps, no panicked breathing, no growls from the shadows. Only Max lying in the hallway, his head resting near the base of a chair, sleeping so deeply that he occasionally let out soft snores. Sarah got up and walked to the kitchen, and for the first time in months, Max didn't startle awake at her movement. He simply opened his eyes, lazily glanced at her, then closed them again. A small, quiet sign, but it meant everything. He believed this place was safe. Emma bounded down the stairs, clutching her thick sketchbook, hair messy and wild in the morning sun. "Mom, I finished my spring picture," she said brightly, handing the notebook to Sarah. Sarah opened it. Three figures sat under a blooming apple tree: a woman, a little girl, and a large dog resting with his head against the girl's legs. Above them, white blossoms drifted through the air. "I think Max is ready to have his own spring now," Emma said quietly. Sarah looked at her, heart swelling. She remembered the first day they met. Max, a shattered soul who knew only how to growl and hide, and now he had become a living symbol of hope of what once seemed impossible. That afternoon, all three stepped outside. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, clear and blue, as if ready to embrace anyone brave enough to believe in something good. Max ran freely through the yard. No leash, no fences. He didn't run away, didn't panic. Every so often, he turned to glance back, eyes searching for Sarah or Emma, not to ask permission, but to affirm, "I'm here. I still belong here." Sarah sat on the porch steps, eyes closed, breathing in the wind, her heartbeat steady and slow. All the tension, all the sleepless nights, all the fear that had gripped her for months, finally melted away like frost beneath spring sun. "I think Max will help a lot of people, Mom," Emma said softly. "Not by finding lost hikers, but by making people believe everyone deserves a second chance." Sarah didn't answer right away because she too had once doubted if Max could make it. She had braced herself for failure, for heartbreak. But what she hadn't prepared for was the faith a 10-year-old girl had in a creature the world had rejected. That evening, the family gathered around the fireplace. Sarah worked on her laptop. Emma curled up on the sofa with a book. And Max walked over and gently rested his head on Sarah's knee. She placed her hand on his head. No hesitation, no testing, no waiting. Max didn't flinch, didn't growl. He stayed on the wall. The photo timeline still hung, but now it had a new frame, a drawing of the three of them under a blooming tree. Emma's art placed proudly in a wooden frame. Beneath it, a certificate read, "Recovery Family, honoring Max for changing perceptions." Sarah smiled when she saw it and whispered like a prayer into the quiet night, "None of us needs to be perfect. We just need someone to believe we can be better." Max lay by the fire, eyes half closed, legs tucked in peacefully. A gentle spring breeze drifted through the window, carrying with it the soft scent of apple blossoms. And in that moment, spring was no longer an idea. It was real. The last night of spring, the sky was scattered with stars, strangely quiet. In the small wooden house nestled beside the forest, Sarah sat alone on the porch, her hands wrapped around a still warm cup of tea. From inside drifted the steady breath of Emma, fast asleep after a long day playing with Max, and the soft clinking of the fireplace still glowing gently to keep the room warm. But what Sarah couldn't take her eyes off was Max lying just outside the door, not in a corner, not curled up in fear, but stretched out across the threshold, eyes half closed, ears alert, but not tense. He was guarding the house like a soldier, yet a soldier who knew he was loved. Sarah watched him quietly, a surge of wordless emotion rising in her chest. Maybe somewhere in this world there were thousands of dogs like Max dogs who had never been held, never taught to trust. Dogs who had been turned into tools by people and then discarded when they were no longer useful. And then they were labeled dangerous, beyond saving them, and unlovable, just like Max once was. But Sarah knew, and now everyone who had witnessed Max's journey also knew, that we cannot define a being based on how it acts when it is hurt. Max was never a broken dog. He was a soul forgotten for too long, judged through fear instead of seen with compassion. On the wall of the living room, the photo timeline of Max's journey remained untouched. The first image, blurry, dark, showed the day Max first stepped into the house. His eyes wild, his posture withdrawn. The following photos marked every small milestone. The first time Max ate while Sarah was in the room. The first time he lay beside Emma without turning away. The first time he rang the bell to ask to go outside. And Sarah's favorite, the moment Max laid his head on her hand, eyes closed as if saying, "I trust you." Beside the timeline was a small, simple frame with the words, "Max, not broken, just needed to be seen." Emma had written that. When she received her honorary volunteer certificate from the center, someone had asked, "What do you think you did to help Max change?" Emma had just smiled and said, "I didn't try to change Max. I just sat still long enough for him to know he didn't have to be afraid of me." Such a simple answer, but to Sarah it held the weight of a lifetime of healing. Max didn't change because he was forced to. He chose to, and that only happened because he was given freedom, patience, and love without condition. Sarah looked at Max as he slept, now their loyal companion, silent guardian, and hero of a family that once wanted nothing more than peace. She placed her hand gently on his head. "You never needed to be fixed," she whispered. "You just needed someone to believe you were worth loving." A soft breeze swept across the porch, stirring the last apple blossoms that clung to spring. Sarah lifted her gaze. Above, the stars shimmered as if blinking in agreement, and inside the house Emma let out a small laugh in her sleep. Max didn't move, but his tail gave a quiet wag, just once, enough to say he understood, and he was grateful.